a thief is always a thief, and you got to go after them. You got to watch them. And so, in looking at all this with Nehemiah, we know that he's facing opposition from without. There'll be people that will be opposing the moves and changes that God wants to do with you. And even if it's not a reconciliation, I remember hearing people saying that they're having this call of God to the mission field. And I've heard that. And I've heard that from young people. And God calls young people. I don't know if you knew that. When you read about the Old Testament, these people that God is calling, these are young people. David being anointed king at between 14 and 16 years of age, for crying out loud. He gives between a 14 and 16-year-old girl the opportunity to birth Jesus, okay? There's moves among young people. And if you were in Sunday school last week, you heard what Joe was saying about the target, what needs to be the target of people making decisions for Christ at like that 12 to 14 years of age, right, is where we need to hone in. Okay, so God calls young people, and so when I'm hearing that people get called like to missions or their heart is being moved, I immediately begin to watch afterwards, and I sense, and you see how outside influences directly come against what they feel is the call of their heart. I don't know if you've ever experienced that before. Maybe it wasn't as big as being called in the mission field. Maybe God was calling you maybe just to do something, and because it was God, there was opposition about it. And it may not have been like a big, horrible ruler guy coming against you. It could have been your own indifference getting in the way of what God was trying to get you to do, okay? Or where he was moving. Maybe he called you to say something to somebody. By the way, he still speaks today. I don't know if you knew that. And I believe that he speaks a lot. I believe from experience in my life, when I haven't heard the Lord, it's because I wasn't listening. So God speaks. He speaks today, and he will speak to you. Put your heart and put yourself in the position to hear and receive from the Lord, which means sometimes you got to turn down the other things in life that are so loud, okay? All right, so we know that there's opposition that was coming from without, but now this week we're going to deal with some opposition that's coming from within, okay? So that idea of, I've been called to do this, I've been called to do that, or I'm getting excited, but then all of a sudden there's opposition sometimes within yourself. You have opposition from the outside, of maybe parents even. I'll tell you, some of the biggest critics of young people's call is parents. And the reason is because the parents have more of a worldly culture view of what their children should do instead of living in the spiritual realm and saying, this is what God has maybe called my child to be in missions or whatever else. A lot of times we're more afraid, I don't want you to do that because I want you to be successful, and I want you, I want you to have your house, I want you to have a husband or a wife, and I want you to have children, and we have sometimes these foreordained things about how our children should live their lives. Don't waste your life on stupid stuff. Now, I agree in certain things. Hey, don't waste your life on video games because that's not going to produce anything really good in your life if you give yourself over to that. But if you give yourself over to the things of God, there are sometimes people who will get a little queasy about their kids, like even talking about missions or talking about, hey, don't get too crazy with the God stuff. Just simmer down a little bit. Or things like, oh, you'll grow out of it. Oh, God, I hope not. What a curse. What a curse to put on your children, that they will grow out of their enthusiasm and desire of loving the Lord and settle. Wow. And I think a lot of church in America today kind of lives that way. Hey, don't get too excited. Now, trust me, I believe that they need wisdom, but they need wisdom not from a worldly point of view of how to live successfully in today's world. They need wisdom from a heavenly point of view that helps them tells them how to navigate the big thing that God is asking them to do. Because just because they're young doesn't mean it's not big. You think, oh, you're just blowing stuff out of proportion. Steve, well, what did Jesus tell the disciples? Come follow me. Leave everything behind. In today's culture, we don't leave everything behind. We pack what we need and what we think are going to be comfortable along the journey of pursuing the Lord. And that's not how it works in the gospel. It's not. I'm not saying you can't have a house. I'm not saying you can't have a tent. But you've got to understand that the things in the world are not the things that you're going to be taking with you into the next. What's waiting for you in the next world are crowns of obedience and pursuing the heart of the Father here. And my fear is that for most of the church, the Big C church, there's not a whole lot reserved in heaven because we pursued everything that we have desired here on earth and brought God along for the ride to bless it. But it's okay. You can get rid of it now. And when I mean get rid of it, I'm not asking you to go home and start throwing stuff away. I'm asking you, as you leave this place now, to make sure that God is the most important thing in your life, and He's the only one that has the throne of your heart. And that if He's asking you to get stuff out of the way, it's no problem, because I love Him more than this. I love Him more than my own life. I love Him more than a big 401k. I love Him more than these types of things. I will spend my life in service of the King, whatever that is. Hey, God is calling people to be nurses. It's not just to the mission field. It's being a mission in the hospital. It's being caring and loving and being a good nurse to people who are sick and dying. See, God is calling people to be doctors. God is calling people to be businessmen. We need good, godly businessmen. Many people have been saying, and even in like the last 10 years, and even I just heard it again, that the next revival is going to be in the marketplace. Is the church prepared for the marketplace revival? Is the church prepared for a revival that is on 5th Avenue South in Clinton? Is the church prepared for Main Street revival? So, okay. So anyway, there's going to be opposition. And there's going to be opposition sometimes from people who are close to you that love you, but their point of view is from a worldly type of how your life should be, not necessarily through the spiritual lens of the gospel and what Jesus has called. Amen? All right. So here's what's happening here. You ever heard of this idea of predatory lending? Heard of that before? Predatory lending is when bank-type businesses and stuff like that. And it's usually, banks are a little bit more regulated, but some of these businesses that come into like an old car dealership, and they're like loans and all these different kinds of stuff, or get your cash now, or get your cash early, and all that kind of stuff. A lot of times what predatory lending does is it looks at the problem. People look and see the problem that you're in, knowing that you need money for something, and then will promise to give you that money, but the problem is that the interest rates are really jacked up high. They'll put you in a lower credit rating than you deserve to get a higher interest rate, okay? And they'll make it virtually almost impossible for you to get out of that without losing your assets that you put up for collateral. I remember a banker who was a Christian one time, who one of the things that he had said was he gets so much joy out of foreclosing on people. And I thought to myself, yeah, man, I think you need to read the Bible a little bit more. Because that's not what I see of a Christian businessman or a banker is supposed to be, of getting joy out of people's desperation. What that tells me is that sometimes, probably within the heart of this person, he was extending loans to people in hopes, with a desire that he'd be able to take their assets. You say, what does that have to do with this? Well, let's look, and I'm glad you asked. It's not a rabbit trail. Surprisingly enough, there was a widespread outcry from the people and their wives against the Jewish countrymen, not against Persia, countrymen, Some were saying, we, our sons, our daughters are numerous. Let us get grain so that we can live and eat. Others were saying, we have mortgaged our fields and vineyards and homes to get grain during famine. Still others were saying, our children are just like our countrymen and their children, yet we are subjecting our sons and our daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters are already enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and vineyards are mortgaged to others. This was not Gentiles doing this to Jews. This was Jews doing this to Jews. And so what they were seeing is like people, first of all, it's a desolated place. Their economy is ruined from what it used to be. And so they're just scratching out to make a living. And now they can't afford to pay the king's tax. And so now they're mortgaging vineyards. They don't have enough grain to eat. So how are they going to buy grain? They don't got no money. And so there are people who are in a position of here who are looking at them down there and are saying, there's an opportunity. If I lend them money, they won't be able to pay it back, but I'll be able to take their vineyards. I'll be able to take all this kinds of stuff because they were doing business according to the world system and not according to the kingdom system of God. And God had already set this up way back in Exodus about how they're supposed to live, and they were not supposed to charge interest to people with a loan. As a matter of fact, if you took somebody's cloak as security for a loan, you were supposed to give it back to them that night because it could be the only cloak that they could keep warm with. And so God's kingdom and economy are a whole lot different than the world system, because I'll tell you what you set up for security for your loan that gets taken away, you ain't getting back. And if your security doesn't cover the loan, guess what? They're coming after you for the rest. And so what the system has created, and it's really the perversion of people in greed, trying to get more and more stuff, that are looking at people who really should have no business really trying to get a loan, but will give you a loan because we know we're going to trap you and keep you in bondage. And the problem is that the Jews who are trying to bring people back from bondage are now keeping people in bondage because of what we would call predatory lending. All right. The problems are the need for grain. 1. 2, others have mortgaged fields to buy grain. 3, some had to borrow money for the king's tax on their fields, and children were subjected to slavery because of debt. And some were already in bondage and couldn't buy them back because their lands were mortgaged. I can't imagine that. I'm thankful. Honestly, to tell you the truth, I don't get where some generations that are born in America are hating America. I'm not saying America is perfect, but if you've never gone to a third world country, you don't understand what you got here. And most of what I hear about the complaining about the United States of America comes from an uninformed generation who's listened to people with agendas that are lying to them. Oh yeah, there's a little bit of truth, absolutely. There's truth that we own and we have to deal with, but it's gone. But listen, when you begin to hate yourself or your nation that you were born into, there's a problem there. There's a problem there. Because God has blessed this nation. Now, for a purpose, to be a blessing, okay? We're not perfect. We've got things we have to fix. We understand that. But you don't fix that by burning down the house and starting all over. Because there is no starting all over once you burn that sucker down. When you're talking about a nation, there's not another nation that's going to come in and rebuild. You're just going to live in ashes. And so we have to fight stupidity and lies with truth while owning the fact that we're not perfect. So I listen to uneducated people talk about, and young people sometimes talk about listening to lies and then talking about how life should be and how wonderful it would be, and yet have no understanding of the case of what socialism really is and what communism really is. No understanding whatsoever. The problem is what you need to do is you don't listen to the leaders of communist countries. that tell you how great things are. Get a hold of the people that are living under it, day in and day out. We've watched nations in decades that have been fruitful, living under a democracy type, that all of a sudden have voted in a socialist thing and watched as their nation is plunged in utter despair. So appreciate and be thankful for what you have in this nation, while understanding it's not perfect, and we need to do what we need to do to deal with the inconsistencies and the wrongs, to bring in a justice and even a social justice, but not burn down the house. All right. So what is happening here? The problems are happening from their own countrymen. It can be hard to get people to work in a system that would still find them severely oppressed, right? So the outcry is to raise awareness to Nehemiah that this is going on. So here you've got a group of people coming back or living in rubble, and we want them to build walls, but we haven't dealt with the issues of their oppression. We haven't dealt with the fact that they're still not getting food, or they're having to deal a different way with lenders, and so they're in bondage, and you can't break out of that stuff a lot by yourself. When you're under bondage of somebody who's got you by the throat and wants your land and wants to keep you there because he's making money off your money. So I had a conversation a few months ago with my children about credit cards. And the thing was, so this is what they want to do. They want you to have a credit card because they want to give you money. Because they want you to spend money so that they can charge you for spending their money. And so, and the interest rates right now on some credit cards are between 18 and 22%. And so you try to pay the minimum payment back, and what's going to happen, people? You're not really paying off the loan because your minimum payment may be $100 on $1,000, and you pay that, and right away, I took $100 off. And then the interest charge comes at the end and tacks on another $20 to $30 back on your credit card. And so it's hard to keep paying the minimum payment because these people, although they may not throw themselves into predatory lending, are using some of the concepts so that they can keep making money off your money. I'm not preaching against credit cards. If you have the willpower to pay it off every month, by all means, do it and get your points. But the majority of people in the United States of America who have been blessed with abundance and a deserving type of attitude do not have the discipline to keep from overspending and getting themselves into trouble to where they can hardly ever pay back what they owe. So some of it is your own fault, and you should repent of it. Maybe rip up your credit cards. I don't know. But if you don't have the discipline to live like that, then don't live like that. As a matter of fact, you should learn to be content with what you have. And if you want more, then do it through the right means. Don't charge it. Do well at your job. Get promotions, raises. Have integrity in your work. Okay. See, we've lost this fundamental understanding from generations in the past. My father started working in the bus company in Clinton, which at that time was actually owned by Interstate Power. It wasn't owned by the city. And so in the 50s, late 50s or very early 60s, he got a job driving bus for Interstate Power around, which is now Alliant, around the city of Clinton. So fine job. Listen, my mom and dad were very poor. They would do their budget on how many times they would be asked to come over and eat dinner at my aunt's house. That's poor, baby. Right? Did they cry? Did they complain? Did they say, we deserve this? No. My dad bid out to the power plant and worked in coal, and sometimes would work 24-hour shifts with a jackhammer. to provide for his family. And so I come along in 1971, the greatest ray of sunshine my parents have ever seen, right? It's like the glory cloud descended on my birth. Couldn't be more happier. I may be a little fictitious on that. But anyway, and I remember growing up, and here's what I remember. I remember not really being in want of anything. But what I didn't understand was how hard they were working for me to have a lifestyle of having what I needed. You know that growing up. Sometimes you never understood or appreciated what your parents were providing for you until you got to the workforce, right? And that whole idea of, well, I deserve this goes out the window because you may have an idea of what you deserve, but the boss has a different idea of what you deserve. And so as my dad is working and striving for, when I started, minimum wage was $3.75. I'm not sure if there was a minimum wage in the late 50s or early 60s, but if there was, it was a lot less than $3.75. 50 cents an hour, okay? So imagine this. And so my father and my mother are working hard to have a house, to build a home full of love, food on the table, all this different kinds of thing, sometimes 24-hour shifts to make sure that's done. And so what happens is there's a recognition on my father's life that this guy's a pretty good worker. Let's put him in something else. And throughout my life growing up, my father goes from a coal guy with a jackhammer to a head maintenance guy. Okay? And that's a good job. And then he goes from maintenance to an operator, which is working at the board, right? All the buttons that would blow it up, my dad's an operator on, right? Okay? Some of you new guys understand. Just because there's a flashing button doesn't mean you need to push it. Okay, so, and then he goes from that to a plant shift supervisor, which means that he was in charge over the whole plant on his shift. So he goes to a shift, and he retired as a shift supervisor at the ML Cap plant that they just blew up, by the way, a few years ago. But there is a progression in their life of working hard, being content with what we have, but still working hard to better life. And there's a lifetime of that as you watch, you see. And God is blessing all the way through that life. And many of you have stories of your parents of the same thing. It's not that I got everything I wanted when I wanted it. I had everything I needed as God was providing, as mom and dad or whoever were working hard as well. And God was in the midst of all of that too. I'm going somewhere with this. I really am. So it can be hard to get people to work in a system that's not fair. And here in Jerusalem, it wasn't fair. There were nobles, Jewish nobles, who were oppressing Jewish workers. And there was no union. Rich, if you'd have lived a few thousand years ago, they could have used you to form a union on that wall, but there was nobody like you to fight for people's rights and to say, hey, listen, maybe 24 hours of work is not the best thing for you to do. Maybe we should scale it back to maybe an 8 hours is enough. So the question is, why is this happening? If you remember that the Jews had walked away from God. So how do you walk away from God? By forgetting His word to start with. A society that walks away from God by drifting away from His word as a culture. A society walks away from God by drifting away His word in the culture. And when we see we are drifting away and are called on it by prophets, we persecute people who are warning us. Jesus reflected on this on Matthew 23 and verse 37, where he says, let me just read it to you. It's really good. I don't know if you read your Bible, but you should. Listen to what he says in chapter 23 and verse 37. "O Jerusalem." It says Jerusalem, Jerusalem, but he's actually shouting it once. "Jerusalem! She who kills prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I have wanted to gather you as children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, yet you were not willing. See, your house is left desolate. For I tell you, you will never see me again until you say, 'He who comes in the name of the Lord is the blessed one.'" So even Jesus is saying there's come a time when the Jews, the prophets they say they so much loved, were the very people they didn't listen to and the very people that they persecuted. They say, "Oh, we love Abraham. Abraham's our father." And Jesus is like, "If Abraham were your father, you would love me. Before Abraham was, I am." You say you love your prophets, but you've stoned and you've killed them. What he's saying is that the Pharisees of his day were no different than the Jews who rebelled and walked away from God and stoned the prophets who were calling them to come back to the Lord. And what we see happening in society today, and I'm not telling anybody something they really don't know, is what we see what was once a blessed nation. And listen, don't listen to revisionist history, because it is out there. When you hear people talking about our forefathers who wanted to make sure that we were a non-religious nation. No. And they'll say things like, we have separation of church and state. It's in the Constitution. No, it is not. They were letters that were sent, and the letters were not about no religion. It was just simply saying what? Anybody know? Huh? Freedom of religion. It wasn't keeping religion out of anything. It was saying you're going to be free to practice it. Nowadays, because of revisionist history and not enough people who understand what's going on, fighting back against it, we're listening to revisionist history that are saying that most of these guys, they didn't want to be controlled by religion. Most of these guys were pastors or had seminary degrees. And even the ones that didn't. Thomas Jefferson, you ever heard of that guy? The revisionist history hero of, he was a deist. He didn't. This guy started a church and had in the Capitol of Congress and had the Marine Corps band play worship. So we as a nation, how far have we drifted from what we've started to be? Because there's a lot of people out there that are educated but are lying. They're deceived. I'm not speaking against education. And I'm not saying everything was perfect. We had problems, but we didn't start off as deists. We didn't start off as avoiding religious. We understood that God had ordained this nation to be on an earth. And where God made a covenant with Israel, America made a covenant with God. And recognized that he was the source and the strength of this nation, and that if this nation ever drifted from it, we were going to be in trouble. Hello, 200 plus years later. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Wasn't perfect. They were human beings. They didn't even have cell phones. How could they be perfect? No. They had issues. And they were addressing issues as well they could. And there were some issues they never got to that wouldn't be addressed probably for 100 years plus later. Serious issues. Issues today that we are still wrestling with and still need to deal with. Just like the Israelites. And if you burn down the house, you proclaim judgment on generations. And there are a whole lot of people speaking judgment of the past. But if you're a believer, you don't stand on judgment. You stand on grace. And because you stand on grace, grace is not acknowledging the issues. Grace is saying we've got to work through these issues and make things better. Not judgment, not burn it. Make it better. And yes, there are many different people that have different ideas of how that happens, and I may not agree with every single one of them. And some of them maybe get voted on and put in as a law that I don't necessarily agree with, but guess what? There are going to be some things that do. And I don't have, and you don't have, the fullness of everything to understand and have every answer. So some of this stuff is left up to the Lord, but we should be putting out truth. Truth is not relative to my situation either. Listen, I think there's too many young people growing up or church people growing up with the understanding that your truth is your truth, but my truth is my truth. Your truth is relative to the situation that you're in. The problem is that's not the truth at all. Truth is not relative. 2 plus 2 is always going to equal 7. No, it's not, is it? But if you live in a relative type of truth society, they're asking you and they're saying things like, okay, well, show me. And maybe that'll be true for you. You don't find relativism in math. And you don't find relativism in sending a man to the moon. Why? Because the rocket will blow up. Because truth is truth, and when you're dealing with gravity. If truth is so relative, then say you don't believe in gravity, it doesn't apply to you, and walk off a building. People don't do that. Why? Because gravity is truth. And the more I have around here, the more I feel the weight of gravity. But we take this idea of truth and we apply it to everything else. And saying your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth and I'm going to live this way and I'm going to find my own path to God. The problem is there are not many paths to God, is there? There is one. So people are saying, well, Jesus is your truth, but Buddha is my truth. Buddha is your truth, but Hinduism is my truth. Or Allah is my truth. Or this, that, and the other. But the reality of it is there cannot be many ways to God. Because Jesus is your truth, then that means there is no other truth. Because he said, I am the way, He says that no one may come unto the Father except by. He says that that narrow is the gate, but wide is the path of destruction. So there are many declarative statements that Jesus makes that he's saying, I'm the only way. There's no truth that is relative in Christianity. He is the way. End of story with that. Which means I can't hold on to a little bit of Jesus over here and a little bit of Hinduism over here and a little bit of that bald little fat guy, cute little guy with the chubby cheeks, Buddha, or in this way, or Allah over here. I can't grab onto all these things and make up my own stuff because that is not truth. And this is one of the big things that an undiscipled church is wrestling with today. And the problem with the church is that we said discipleship was a class and left it at that. Listen, life is hard and life is unfair. The problem is people are fighting as hard as they can to make life fair. That's trying to put out a fire with gasoline. It's never going to happen. Even old gasoline, never going to happen. You're not going to put out the fire with gasoline. The issue is, as believers, we understand that life is not fair, but we also understand that we have a king who has reconciled me back to himself and has given me what I don't deserve. It's not fair for me to have salvation, but he did it anyway. And there are things that I will face in my life in this world that may seem not fair, but if I have a great understanding of what Jesus has done for me in my life, I will understand that I can deal with unfairness at times because I know I've gotten better than I deserve from him. And I know that there's a heavenly kingdom coming. And I know that at some point there'll be a heavenly kingdom here on earth. But the reality of it is what is going to happen, the fullness is going to happen when he comes. Amen? Doesn't mean I don't fight for these things. I do, but I understand that I'm living in a world where nothing is ever going to be perfect until the perfect one comes. So I may lose some battles, but I've already won the war. All right. So we have this going on, and so this is what Nehemiah is going to do. Nehemiah is going to get in the business, all right? So this is what he says. I became extremely angry when I heard of their outcry and these complaints, and after seriously considering the matter, I accused the nobles and officials, saying to them, each one of you is charging his countrymen interest. All right, now, the interest of that day, you ready for this? Staggering, 1%. I would kill for that interest rate on anything. I would be happy with 3.75% on a house loan. Woo! Everybody is jumping up for joy, right? Car loans, low interest rates, everybody is happy. What are you complaining about? 1% interest? All that stuff, you know what I just said about the United States and drifting? Because from the very beginning, there was no interest. You didn't charge your countrymen interest at all. And because they as a nation had walked away from God, drifted away from the Father, they took on the system of the world and started doing things like the world. Now, they were called to come out and be separate, but they just couldn't do it. They were so wrapped up, coming out of Egypt. Oh, were things better when we're back at Egypt? A lot of times when things start to get uncomfortable, you forget about the bondage that you lived in because of uncertainty and fear and not trusting what God has called you to. So you want to go back to what you know is oppressive because there was structure behind it. And sometimes there's a security of structure even though it's oppressive. People really have a hard time with freedom. They really do. And you can't force freedom on people. We try that in certain wars we fought. Hey, look, democracy. You love it. You can't force this stuff on humans. The reason the experiment of the United States worked is because the people who were living in that time were willing to fight and die for what they believed in. If you don't have that, you won't get the pure form of that. Okay. Man, the writing is on the wall, people. You got something? Yeah, absolutely. Come forward.
Okay,
That's not sorry.
Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, so Holy Spirit, give me wisdom. So I did not know what Pastor Steve was speaking about today. And I had a dream last night that was really, really intense. And it was like one of those all-night type dreams. And God speaks to me a lot in dreams and in visions. It's one of the main ways he speaks to me. And so this dream was an all-night dream, but it pertains to this message and this church and this region. And it has to do with this exact message. And I feel like the dream was in a response to the prayer and the fasting that's going on. Like the Lord's pleased that the prayer and the fasting is happening. And now, in order to step into the next level and to walk as his kingdom people, kingdom life, right? His ambassadors. But what happened in this dream, and it's interesting because at the end of the dream, I'll get to it, and I'll make the point, but I had to come into the sanctuary because I was looking for you to help me, and you had on the same outfit and everything. And, right, and the dream was an all-night dream, and it was so intense that I overslept my alarm, and so I just had to hurry up and, try and get here on time for worship practice. And, yeah, so, but with it, what happened was I was living in the house that I'm living in right now, and, it's here, it's in Morrison, and I was just going about my everyday life, and people showed up at my house, And they wanted to attack me, they wanted to hurt me, I think some of them wanted to like do terrible things to me and like kill me. And I'm like, what is going on? Like I literally, it's just like a ruckus comes to my front door. And what it is it's people from all ages. They're all different ages. There's older people, there's younger people, but it is actually mainly middle-aged and older people. Actually, there weren't that many young ones there, but the gist was the community came to my house, and they were wanting to beat me, and I was like, what's going on, you know? But the gist of it was they all wanted to beat me and kill me because I was black. They were all white. And, you know, I'm used to being a bridge builder in my life. I think God just put that on me for a lot of areas, for different cultures, for different vocations, different ways of thought. So I'm used to being walked on a lot just to bring two different groups together. But in the dream, it was abrasive. It was all of a sudden. And so I hope that, you know, our nation doesn't get to this point again. Like up here in the north, you know, I've lived in the north my whole life, but you know how fickle and how easily people can be led astray if they don't have the Holy Spirit. We know what happened in 2020, and I think terrible things are coming again, unfortunately. I'm just gonna say that. So thank you for trusting me with that.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna like go and say everything, but I feel like if God has called us to be his people, his ambassadors, and we're fasting, we're praying for outbreak of revival and his presence, then we need to steward his presence. And part of stewarding his presence is loving people well. Yeah. And the reality is, you know, looking across the room, even this church, like everybody here is white. And I think me and my Leah and my sister and my family were the only ones here who are not white. I'm fine, I'm comfortable with that. I've been in a lot of different situations, but a lot of this community in this region is very, very racist. And I've lived in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, and I've never experienced here lack of love. And so I can tell you stories I won't even go into, but I've experienced a lot of things since being here. I'm also able to forgive and live my life because I know who I am, and I know that nothing can hold me down because I belong to the King. But a lot of people who are black or other races, they don't have that maturity yet, and they don't have they don't have that closeness with the Lord yet. A lot of them aren't believers yet. Some of them are. The reality is Jesus was oppressed. He knows what oppression's like. He was a Jewish man. Like he gets all that. And so I have learned to trust him in that way. And so I don't hold any offense towards people. But in the dream, these people literally were going to drag me out of my house, and they were going to kill me. And I just used common sense. It's like, I haven't done anything wrong. What are you talking about? I'm a teacher. I have degrees. I teach your kids. Like, what are you saying? I don't get it. But they weren't having any of it. They were just full of anger. They were full of rage. Some of them tried to hit me, but like I'm a pretty strong person, so I just used self-defense and like withheld them for as long as I could, because I don't want to hurt you. Like, what are you talking about? Go home. But they literally were going to invade and just do that. And so I was like, let me find Pastor Steve. And I came, ran across this way, came into the sanctuary. He wasn't here, but they followed me, so they're gathering in the sanctuary, and then I found him in a side room. And I was going to tell him, I was going to tell you what was going on. Like, hey, can you vouch for me? Like, these people are trying to kill me. And, it was all about race. That was the only thing. It was just because I was a black woman. But the reality is when you live in oppression, whatever that oppression looks like, you need someone who is on the other side to partner with you.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how smart I am. It doesn't matter how many languages I can speak. It doesn't matter how many awards I won in society. I'm black. They hate me because I'm black. I needed an older white man, someone that they value, to say, hey, you leave her alone, because if you mess with her, if you touch her, then I'm going to do something about it. that's what needed to happen in the situation. And in the dream, I was coming to you, and you had already you arrested some young man who was had some weapon, and so you were getting ready to intervene. You were in the midst of, gonna intervene, and there was a crowd coming behind me. And there was